Continue to unpack what has been, some are calling a very tumultuous time for the interviews to appoint a new Chief Justice. UCT Public Law Associate Professor Cathy Powell. Professor Powell joining us this morning. Hello to you, Cathy. Good to have you with us. I'm going to ask about the interview process being questioned. Just before we get to that, just your initial brief thoughts. What did you make of the interviews? Did you pick up any issues that stand out for you?
Yes, several. I don't think the JSC emerged looking very good, although these interviews were much better than the ones that had to be overturned and redone last year. I was very concerned by the infantilizing treatment of Justice Maya. It was disturbing to see the JSC used as a political grandstanding forum by some of the commissioners, with both Mlambo and Zondo. It's disturbing to see the JSC conduct its interviews as though it is a meeting of parties, some sort of parliamentary, not just debate, but sort of slinging match, rather than a forum in which particular people's capacity and fitness for a specific job with specific criteria gets interrogated. Basically, one had the feeling that very few commissioners were actually prepared, that they hadn't checked those CVs, they hadn't read through the judgments, thought, oh, now that's an interesting judgment. Why did the person say this and not that? How does it meet this legal requirement and so on? If that had been done, and it was for some of them, then the judges would have been able to show their fitness for this office. As it happened, that wasn't really what unfolded in those grueling days of interviews.
Calls for the process to be started over again, to be restarted, mulliganed, if you will. Cathy, what do you make of those calls?
I think we're all just too exhausted, A. B, I'm not sure that the result's going to be any different if the composition of the JSC remains the same and if the JSC doesn't get some really good lessons in how to conduct job interviews. Recall that the last time the JSC was made to rerun interviews, it ended up submitting exactly the same list of candidates to the president. So, go back and try again doesn't help if the JSC commissioners themselves can't work out what they're doing wrong. And from the obviousness of some of the mistakes, and I'm thinking especially of the interview with Justice Maya, but also the interview with Mlambo. From the obviousness of some of those mistakes, it's clear they're not working out what they're doing wrong or they don't care, and therefore the problem is more than just those interviews. The problem is the people in the job and the understanding of how the job is supposed to work.
There were suggestions over the weekend as well from various avenues, Cathy, I'm sure you'll be aware of it, that perhaps not to scrap the interviews per se, but for the president himself to use this as a basis to sit down and interview each candidate in person on his own. Is that a way forward, do you think? What did you make of that suggestion?
That's a possibility. The Constitution says that the president has to choose a Chief Justice after consulting the JSC and other bodies. So the president is not bound by the JSC's recommendation. In fact, I noticed that Kazakh has now claimed the JSC should not have made a specific recommendation. It should merely have delivered a report on all four candidates. There's nothing to stop the president from sitting down with all four and interrogating further and hopefully doing a better job than the JSC did.
Because I can't help but worry as well, Cathy, that if they don't, again, not to scrap the interviews, but if the president weren't to sit down one-on-one with each candidate, in years to come, every judgment made by a Chief Justice, every time the court comes to a conclusion, there are going to be critics who are going to bring us back to that moment last week during their interviews that will show they shouldn't have been in that position. You've got to kick the tin a bit further down the road, don't we?
Well, yes and no. I mean, if the president does have these one-on-one interviews and if they're not televised, for example, then there can be all sorts of other reasons to find something wrong with a judgment or a judge further down the road. You can say, oh, well, who knows what was promised or what was accepted. So I think we're in a bit of a hiding to nowhere if we're trying to appease the critics, because not all of the criticism of the JSC processes or the judges have been in good faith. So there's no point trying to make people happy. Let's just do the job properly. And I think if the president would like further information, he'd be okay to get it. I suppose, going back to your question, should he speak to them one-on-one, there is the slight problem that those would presumably be in-camera meetings. And we've already had criticisms about judges in the executive meeting outside of the normal, the official channels of the court.
Let's imagine for a moment, Cathy, before I say goodbye to you briefly, if it's at all possible, how would you do this going forward? Once again, we've had the interviews in public, a lot of criticism because of that. Going forward to the next Chief Justice, whenever that might be in years to come, how would you do it?
I'd keep the public interviews, and I would send all of the commissioners to a law course or a philosophy course on logic. And I would get the commissioners themselves to debate, possibly in public, what the purpose of that proceeding is. I heard Advocate Mpofu saying when he announced the recommendation of the JSC that he was a representative of Parliament. And that bothered me immensely, because I think the role of the JSC, yes, is representative, because it's a body choosing an unelected body who are the judges. So to some extent, the people have to be involved. But the language they have to talk once they get there is the language of a serious job interview, where they take the criteria that have to be filled and work out whether they're met by the person in front of them. Now, the people in those rooms, in that room, making sexist jokes about having slept with one of the judges, or attacking judges with unsubstantiated rumors, or going all sort of lovey-dovey and gentle to Judge Maya, none of them seem to have a grip on what is the job I've got to do as a commissioner on the JSC. And I think I'd start there. I'd possibly change the composition of the JSC, and I would make it very clear that while you might have been sent by a particular constituency, you're there to do a job that requires you to interrogate legal qualifications of the person before you.
Cathy, I appreciate it, as always. It's always good to have you on. Always appreciate the candor as well. So does South Africa. The Associate Law Professor, Cathy Powell from UCT, joining us this morning on the South African Morning. Cathy, thank you again for your time.